Well, welcome everybody. We have this week's Torah portion is Vayishlach, and we are still in the book of Genesis. So we have really what's going on in this Torah portion is, it's funny because 2 weeks ago we had this fight between brothers, between Isaac's sons, between Jacob and Esau, and then last week was the big part of it was this sort of conflict between sisters, between Rachel and Leah. And this week we return. It's like it's a returning storyline of really between the two brothers, Jacob and Esau. Now there's this concern that Jacob has that Esau is not going to be happy. He's not going to be happy because the last time he saw him, he fled basically. And he really just had to escape, and now he's encountering him again, and he's trying to get his family away safely and soundly. What's really fascinating is this really curious episode, and I'm going to throw it up on the screen, and we are in chapter 32 of Genesis. So just a little bit of, just for some context, so here's the beginning of the Torah portion, Vayishlach. Jacob sent messengers ahead to his brother Esau because he knew he was in the area, and he's concerned. I'm not going to read every single verse here, every single line, but Jacob is concerned because if just to go back 2 Torah portions ago, Esau was the hunter. He was like the strong guy. He was, I don't want to say the manly man, but sure, if that works for you, that was how we would characterize him. He was a man of the field. He was a hunter. He knew his weapons. That was Esau. Jacob was more of a simpleton. Maybe he was not so simple, but he dwelt in tents. So if you are the more straightforward son living in tents, you would be scared. I think all of us would be scared of one's brother who not only is the more hunter, the more fieldsy, outdoorsy, but also the one from whom you basically tricked your father into giving you this special blessing that your brother ultimately did not. So that's the context. That's the setup for what's going on. And like Jacob really doesn't know what to expect. So he's afraid. He prays to God. He does these different things. Now, what happens is this really interesting thing. So the stuff goes ahead. He sends out a gift to his brother while he remained in the camp. So now we get to the scene, what I would like to describe as this. Debbie, did you have something, or we're good?
No, sir, I'm fine. Thank you. All right,
so, absolutely. So here's the scene. This is the scene I want to focus on. There's still more in the Torah portion to be sure, but so I'm going to read some of this. But I'm definitely going to discuss it as well because this is really, it's a curious episode. Let me put it that way. It is a really interesting episode, and the book of Genesis has a lot of interesting things that happen. So that same night, Jacob arises and he takes his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 children and crosses the ford of the Jabbok or the Yabok. After taking them across the stream, he sent across all of his possessions. Jacob was then left alone. So he had sent off everybody, certainly everybody he loves, and he is by himself. And a man, this is where it gets a little strange. A man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. So that is a long wrestling session, but also, yes, I'm going to continue and then we'll come back to this. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, meaning this man sees that he hasn't prevailed yet against Jacob. He wrenched Jacob's hip at its socket so that the socket of his hip was strained as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." But he answered, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." That's Jacob telling this anonymous person. Said the other, "What is your name?" He replied, "Jacob."
Okay.
"My name is Jacob."
And then they
So he said, so this man, we don't know who he is or where he came from.
Yeah, so it doesn't run.
Okay, we don't know where he came from, where he is, what knowledge he has of Jacob otherwise, but he then tells Jacob, no, you know what? Your name is no longer going to be Jacob. That's not your name anymore. Your name now will be Israel. Now, he doesn't just give him a name randomly because he thinks that it sounds nice, it's pleasing to the ears, or he thinks it's a funny name. No, he gives the specific reason why that specific name, which is, for you have striven with both divine beings and human beings, and you have prevailed. And don't worry, we'll get back to this because this is going to be a big focus. And Jacob asked, pray tell me your name. But he said, you must not ask my name. And he took leave of him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, meaning I have seen a divine being face to face, yet my life has been preserved. The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping on his hip. And here's the kicker. That is why the children of Israel to this day do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the socket of the hip, since Jacob's hip socket was wrenched at the thigh muscle. So that's, and then we're not going to keep going, but just for context, looking up, Jacob sees Esau coming and all this stuff. So basically, Jacob and Esau have their long-awaited encounter, and it does not go as badly as Jacob presumes it will go. Okay, so that is the story. Okay, so that's the story. The very first question, I mean, for me, for years, I find this so fascinating because the text is very circumspect about who this person is, who this man is. What they clearly go through the entire story being entirely nameless. The book of Genesis does not provide this person a name, nor does, and they absolutely refuse to provide their name in the story, certainly to Jacob. Now, I mean, the first thing that amuses me was that he says, let me go, for dawn is breaking. Well, I mean, certainly I don't understand, what does one have to do with the other? Why should dawn, the rising of dawn, necessitate you got to let me go. Let me go because dawn is here, sun's here. It's funny, I mean, for me, clearly they had no sense of what vampires were, but it makes me think about like 19th century, early 20th century notions of vampires where they can't be out in the sun, which is amusing to me. But somehow this person could only be there in the dark and not during daylight time. And I don't know how much this person really knows Jacob, but he says, so why Israel? So he says his name will be Israel. So Yisrael, why? Because Sarita, you have striven with both gods and people, and you have prevailed. So it's not simply that you've somehow, and it's not clear how much of this is fighting, or just like wrestling. So both wrestling with human beings and wrestling with whatever divine beings are, whatever that means. And I think this is, before we go on, I want to really focus on this because last week we had one of the children of Leah was Judah or Yehudah, and that is ultimately where Jews, when we say Jews, where does the word Jew or the name Jew come from? It ultimately comes from Judah, because Judah was one of the last remaining tribes of the Israelite tribes. And so most Jews around these days, like nowadays, ultimately come from, most of everybody come from the tribe of Judah. And so we're called Yehudim, or ultimately Jews. But the root of the name of Judah comes from Oda, or giving praise or thanks, which was really fascinating to have it the same week as we had Thanksgiving. That the notion of Thanksgiving is a really, it's a core, it's part of our name as Jews, that the value of giving thanks is part of who we are as a people. However, another name for our people is also Israel, or Yisrael. For when we were both in the desert as well as ultimately settling in the land of Israel. So what does the name Israel mean? It goes back to this story, that we are, as a people, as children of Israel, because Jacob now receives this name change from Jacob to Israel, that we are about sort of, I don't want to say striving, but we wrestle with both people and with God, and that we have, that there is this, I want to say a wrestling component, but certainly a being in the conversation with. If we want to be less violent, maybe, let's say, if we want to be less violent about things, we would say we like to converse, to debate, to wrestle over these things, which is a really interesting thing, because I think when it comes to thinking about names and identity as a nation, that this is actually stands in like, I think someone hearing this would say, okay, that sounds nice. Like, we wrestle with ideas and we wrestle with people, we wrestle with God, but it's not to be taken for granted. At the total opposite end, there's another nation. What's another nation that we see nowadays? Oh, Islam, right? So Islam prides itself on giving fealty to Muhammad, to their deities. That it's an act of submission, right? That's what what Islam is about. What being a Muslim is submitting to God, submitting, and it's really about submission to God, right? So the relationship there is about fealty, is about submission. Whereas as the Jewish people, as the Bnei Yisrael, as Israelites, we don't have, like, to some degree, yes, there is a sense of submission to God, but we don't totally submit. We have this arguing sense. If you look earlier in the book of Genesis, what does Abraham do with God? And he is arguing to try to save these different towns of Sodom and Amorah. He argues with God, he debates, he bargains with God, right? And I think that is a really fascinating and fantastic example of what does it mean to be a child of Israel, of the Jewish nation. It means that we don't just accept what God says. We are a little bit contentious with it, right? We argue, and that really goes back to part of the fundamental nature of who we are as a nation, as a people, is that we question, we debate, we argue. This is part of what makes us up as a people, and it's right there in the name, that we are a people that does argue, that does debate, right? And we certainly debate amongst ourselves. I mean, it sounds like, it is a joke that you have two Jews and you have three opinions, right? You're going to have multiple opinions. Put Jews in a room, we're going to debate, we're going to argue. And that, I think, is certainly part of what it means to be Jewish. And that's fine. Like, that is who we are. That is not a bad thing. That is actually a feature of that's not a bug, it's a feature. It's really a primary component of what makes us Jewish people, is that we have that liveliness, that we contend with each other, and it works to our, yes, we have our divisions, we have our factions, we have our denominations, we have our groups, we have our organizations, we have our this and we have our that, but that and even in the Bible, we have our 12 tribes. Like, as much as we want to talk about being a united people, we also have our divisions, but that also helps contribute to the liveliness, to the colorfulness of what it means to be part of the Jewish people. So I just find that really fascinating as far as who we are, what that name says about who we are as a people. And it's funny. It reminds me of this story. I think it's probably a Yiddish story somewhere, but I know that I think Elie Wiesel had it as the beginning of one of his books, where he spoke about being in a concentration camp. And one evening at this concentration camp, they had basically a court proceeding where they put God on trial. So obviously they're in a concentration camp. They are in really dire circumstances, and they have debates and they argue. And I think ultimately they convict God as guilty. Either they convicted God as guilty or as being totally absent or dead or whatever it was. But God was not in the right. They were definitely arguing against God, but they finished and they said, okay, now it's time to pray. It was time for the evening prayer at that time. And nevertheless, even though they argued with God, and even though they were really deeply upset at God, nevertheless, they still prayed to God in a minyan. So I think that says something about who we are as a people. We don't just dump God away, that we argue, and yet we still, it's part of a relationship. That the Jews are in a relationship not only in a horizontal way between us and God, but also in a vertical way. And we also have, it's not about submission. It is about having those relationships. Aren't always obsequious in their nature. They aren't always just, yeah, we'll take whatever you have to say. There's a relationship there that humans, and in this context, Jews have relationship with other humans and with God. And it can be a little rocky. It can be a little contentious. But that's what it means to be in a relationship.
My understanding, man, from listening to you, is that Jewish comes from Judea, or what is his name?
Judah, yeah, Yehuda, Judah.
Judah. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
I mentioned, so I don't know. Yeah, I didn't mention it. I don't think I mentioned it in the discussion here for Village Torah, but I did throw it in the Shabbat newsletter if you wanted to take a look back at it. But yeah, the way
I did. I read it.
Oh, great! Thank you for reading. But it really comes from the fourth child of Leah, of Yehuda, of Judah, and she says, because this time, Oda, I will praise God. Now that I've received this fourth son, I'm going to give thanks to God. And I found it really fascinating last week. It happened to be the same Torah portion that we had Thanksgiving in. So it was very timely about Thanksgiving is a value of our people, and it's there in one of our names. One of our names is Israel, right? We're the children of Israel, but we're also known now, at least for the last couple centuries, as Jews. And so as Yehudim, in rabbinic literature, an individual is called a Yehudi, and plural Yehudim. So already that was, 2 millennia ago, we're called Jews, Yehudim, based off of, from that root of giving thanks, of giving praise. Yeah. So these.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have, when it comes to Jews' names, so we have sort of three different, as a people, we have sort of three different names. One is an older biblical word, Ivri, a Hebrew, like, and plural Ivri, the Hebrews, and that was because we were, it's interesting. It's not just language. It's also a notion of ever, of var, of the other side. Like one would say, actually, this is actually in what we were just talking about. I could point to it here. So, okay, so in this, I mentioned this, after taking them across the stream, he sent across all his possessions. So this word, actually it pops up a lot here. So Vayivreim, he took them across, Vayaver, and he sent across all his possessions. Then we also get it here, Vayavor, he crossed the ford. So it's crossing, or it's going to the other side of like a river, right? So this notion of ever, which pops up right here, and what we're talking about right now is going to the other side. So the Jews are or the Hebrews are kind of like on the other side of a river, let's say. We're sort of a different people, which is nice. We are kind of our own different sort of selves. We're kind of different. We also are, as I mentioned in last week's Torah portion, we are praise givers. We are about giving thanks, of acknowledging good when we have received that. And then what we see here in this wrestling story, as it were, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you've striven with beings both with God and with human beings. That there's this, I don't want to say an outright contentiousness, but certainly there's maybe even a fighting spirit, certainly a liveliness. And that and I think that what we see nowadays, Jews have their opinions, Jews question, right? We are not a people of submission. We ask questions, right? Even in one of our more foundational rabbinic texts, the Talmud, rabbis are asking questions. Questioning is part of who we are as a people and part of our intellectual tradition. So these three,
Therefore,
right? So
therefore,
yeah,
we as a people are, because it's a part of our tradition, it would then be part of our life form, right?
yeah, it's part of our lifestyle and our identity. All three of these
Right.
names of what we call ourselves, whether it's Hebrews because we're kind of different, Jews because we acknowledge good, and then three, this Israel of being contentious and maybe even an arguing people, right? So I think it's not that one necessarily replaces another. I think they're all in play. I think they all say something about these names all say something about our identity and who we are as a nation, as a people.
Okay.
Yeah. This good? That makes sense?
It makes total sense.
Awesome. One final thing is, it's a funny little coda. It just almost comes out of nowhere. This final verse in this 32nd chapter and this story with Jacob wrestling with this guy, that this is why the children of Israel to this day do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the socket of the hip, since Jacob's hip socket wrenched at the thigh muscle. So this sinew, I think it's called a sinew or I don't know. Whatever it is, this in Hebrew it's called the gin hanasheh. That I know. I don't remember exactly how we say it in English, but this gid hanasheh, and this is like literally the only. It's not like it's mentioned anywhere else in the Torah. It's not like in the book of Leviticus or Numbers. It comes up. It just here. There's this story. The Jews don't eat this, and it's because of this story. Like the sort of Israel naming story. We got our name and we refrain from eating this part of wherever it is in these animals. So
Now we do that to this day.
yeah, we still do. And so it's interesting.
What kind of meat is it?
I don't know exactly. Here's what I do know off the top of my head. So well, like I said, it's this thigh muscle, wherever it is, so somewhere near the leg and it's for cows. And so so here's an interesting difference between America and Israel, the way this is treated in the present day, which is that in America, for kosher butchers for this area, they just chop it all off and they don't even touch it. But in Israel, because there is a way to remove it finally, like it's not an easy removal, but there's a way to remove it out and then still make the rest of the meat consumable for kosher consumption. From what I've heard, that it involves a certain deal of difficulty and finesse that it's harder to do in America. That having been said, one thing that we have in America is that it can then just be sold to Gentiles or people who don't care about kosher. So it's not commercially harmful. You can just chop off that whole area and sell it to someone else. They'll be happy to take it because they don't keep kosher. But in Israel, they don't exactly have that market, the non-kosher consuming market, to the same degree as they have in America. So they're going to make use of it. But yeah, it's still done to this day. Great.
Thank you.
All right, my pleasure. So hopefully this was helpful, getting a better sense of using names as a sense of who we are and identity as the Jewish people. All right. Well, Debbie, thank you so much. And Faye also, thank you so much for being with us as well today. So thank you again.
I want to ask you one question.
Absolutely.
Up at the top of what you have on our page,
Yes.
you have SEFARIA.
Yes.
Is that the portion of the Torah that we're reading this week?
So that is the website that I'm utilizing. It's called Sefaria.
Oh.
It's got a lot of Jewish text on there. And
Okay.
it's really cool because then you can click on a text and then it can take you to various other texts. And it's really cool because it connects everything.
Thank you. very much. And I
My-
enjoyed this today. I learned something too.
Wonderful. I'm very happy to hear that. I'm very glad. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Debbie and Faye, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom to you, sir.